Hello, everyone. Good morning. Good day. Welcome to today's webinar. Thank you for joining us here today. As we get started here, we'll let folks trickle in for about a minute, and then we'll get started here. So as you are coming in, if you've been to one of these before, there is a little chat tab here on the right side of the screen. And if you would you go ahead and drop in there where you're calling in from today? We always like to see what parts of the world are represented. So I'm calling from Cincinnati, Ohio, here in the USA. It is 9 in the morning my time. And my partner here, Rasmus, is in Copenhagen, Chicago. Welcome, everybody. So go ahead and, as we're giving it about another 30 seconds here, go ahead and drop in the chat. UK, welcome, Boston, Pittsburgh. And we'll go ahead and get started here momentarily. Hello from Israel and Norway. Always quite a few European representatives here in the chat. So welcome, everybody, and thank you for calling in here in your afternoons here. I hope it is not as cold as it is here in the US right now. Well, we are at the minute mark. Canada, Italy, Cleveland, welcome everybody. Ireland, thank you for dropping that in. Continue to drop in the chat where you're calling in from as you join us here, please. And let's go ahead and get started here. Today's webinar is called Avoiding the Top Pitfalls in MedTech Clinical Data Collection, 2025 Strategies for Success. My name is Chris Rush. I'll be your moderator today, as well as the co-host for the session. And I'm also a medical device guru here at Greenlight Guru. I'm a biomedical engineer, and I've spent my entire career in the medical device and medtech industries. I've managed global clinical trials. I've worked on PE prevention product lines with input from global leaders, both pre-market as well as post-market. And now I spend my time here working with Greenlight, with medtech teams, much like yourselves, many calling in here today, that are planning for upcoming as well as ongoing clinical activities. And I've been here at Greenlight for about 3 years. And welcome everybody that is calling in. Taylor Brown, hello. Taylor's one of our Greenlight gurus. So just a quick piece of housekeeping here before we dive into the presentation. Firstly, we do invite you to actively participate. Many of you already are. You'll see that chat tab on the right side, and this is really intended to connect with fellow attendees that have called in, engage with others. There's also a Q&A tab right next to that chat tab. And within that Q&A tab, I've got a task for everyone here. If you have any questions, please do drop that in the Q&A portion there. So I'll put in some holder text. Here's a question, just so you see a little, maybe an icon pop up there. So the Q&A tab is where you will drop your questions. Also within that Q&A tab, you can give a thumbs up to upvote any questions that you particularly like or you'd like to echo. And we will try to prioritize. In fact, we won't just try. I will prioritize based on how many times a question's been upvoted. So if you like one, please do give it a thumbs up, and we'll start with the ones that are most upvoted. Secondly, we will be sending out the full recording of today's session, as well as the presentation slides to all the registrants here after the live event. So please do watch your inbox for that follow-up email. Just a few words about Greenlight Guru. Here at Greenlight Guru, our mission is to improve the quality of life through our work in the medtech industry, likely a shared goal as many of you here today. And we host these free webinar sessions to share valuable insights from top industry experts, as well as to showcase our industry-leading solutions. Our software solutions are designed to help medtech companies bring life-changing products to patients faster, more efficiently, and with less risk. Our MedTech suite includes software solutions for product development, quality management, and clinical data management, all tailored specifically for the MedTech industry. And you can join over 1,100 leading MedTech companies that trust Greenlight Guru by visiting us at greenlight.guru. And you can request a personalized demo after today's webinar as well. Today's topic relating to clinical data, I want to mention that at Greenlight Guru, we built the leading toolbox for clinical data collection and management, specifically designed for medtech companies. The Greenlight Guru clinical software is a single compliant platform for the collection and management of all clinical evidence, safety, and performance data. And if you're interested in learning more about this and how it can help you streamline your clinical operations, please feel free to reach out to us as well. Now, to quickly introduce my co-presenter, Rasmus Blendahl is a product manager here at Greenland Guru, focused on the clinical products. He, like myself, is a biomedical engineer with expertise in bridging the clinical and technological worlds. His experience includes work in developing software for clinicians and patients, combining his technical skills with a deep understanding of clinical needs to deliver impactful solutions. So without further ado, let's jump into the presentation here, and I'll just do a quick introductory bit here before I pass it over to Rasmus. Today we'll be talking about some of the pitfalls. Here are some general challenges that we see as we talk to customers day in, day out. MedTech operations are a little bit different than pharmaceutical trials, for instance. Typically smaller, require quite a bit different data, and data collection can include anything from clinical studies, but also surveys, case series, design validation, and of course, regulations as it is across the board in all of medicine are constantly changing, and of course should remain a focus, and it certainly is for us here at Greenland Guru. Highlights new regulations in Europe under the MDR have been an increased elevated focus for not just us, but everybody that we speak to day in, day out. As well as updated standards, so ISO 14155, which Rasmus, I believe, is going to touch on right off the bat as he gets into his presentation. But also this fourth bullet point, data for medical devices really is becoming more and more important, not just for regulatory clearance or approval, but also devices, MedTech solutions, IVDs are being evaluated even by procurement, purchasing at hospitals based on performance safety data, both before and after application, pre-market as well as post-market. So let's go ahead and get started here. And Rasmus, I will pass the mic to you and I'll share your first slide and I'll step back for the moment.
Thank you, Chris, and hello, everyone. If you are a client at Greenland Guru Clinical, you have perhaps run into me, as I've been part of the company for going on 9 years now. Started with onboarding clients and then I moved into product management. We're starting off with the first pitfall. This is one that will likely be an evergreen within this world, and that's starting off on the wrong foot, using a general tool and not a built-for-purpose tool. The main issue here has to do with validation. And validation has become a very big topic ever since the introduction of ISO 14155 2020, where in section 7.8.3, that's a lot of numbers, it speaks to the responsibilities of sponsors as it pertains to computerized systems. Here they mention a lot about validation of the system you're using for clinical activities. And this goes for any sort of clinical activity you're doing. So long as you want to submit it to a competent authority, it must be validated. And a solution to using general tools is that you go with a system that helps you with this documentation and the validated nature. Here at Greenland Guru, for instance, we keep our software validated. So the software itself is validated at all times. We provide documentation, and that's something you should request from your provider as well. And here it's important to differentiate a bit on validation. There's essentially two parts to it. There is the system validation, which is very large and should be done by the service provider. And then you have a study validation. And that's where you validate the setup you've done in, for instance, your EDC system as it corresponds to the protocol. Here you must ensure that there's a one-to-one and the system will work in a way that fits your protocol. That's more of an ad hoc activity that will have to be done by whomever is setting up the study in the EDC system, for instance. This also goes for surveys. If you want to use the data collected from surveys, you must also use a validated software. And with that, we move to the next point.
Yeah, thanks, Rasmus. And Rasmus just talked about some of the compliance validation pieces of the software. I want to talk a little bit more about kind of the practical considerations. So from the validation compliance aspects of software tools that needs to be built in. But let's touch on some of the practical stuff that we hear teams facing day in, day out that we're speaking with. What really is causing teams headaches when they're using basic tools for complex studies? And also, what are practical ways to simplify addressing the complexity of studies and ultimately using software tools to empower your team with real-time data visibility, ultimately for better decision making by your internal clinical team, your tight-knit team that you're working with every day, but also your leadership team internally at the sponsor, as well as, of course, regulatory agencies that are providing oversight. So several pitfalls I want to touch on that relate to relying on more manual tools. Are you still sending site binders? And site binders is kind of antiquated, probably for the most part, hopefully. Back in the old days, everything was sent to sites via site binders, everything from protocols, case report forms, consents. So by this, I'm not asking, are you literally sending everything via binders? Probably not everybody is, but really asking, what are you sending to sites on electronic paper or even hard paper directly to sites, and what are you doing to manage that paper? You're probably using spreadsheets to do so. Creating site binders, compiling emails with attachments, tracking everything on spreadsheets really is taking hours to construct those materials, as well as quality check them and track what was sent. I did that manually on a paper-based study way back in the day myself. So even if you're not sending everything in binders, what are you sending to sites on paper or electronic paper? Are you sending case report forms? Are you sending consents via email or even on paper? This really becomes a pitfall that becomes apparent. For example, as you start a study and things start to scale up, so even having asynchronous study start times at different sites. So perhaps site A is ready today, but site B is not ready for another 4 weeks. So as you prepare for the first site, you have to kind of time all of that and do that in a manual way. Also, studies, the second bullet point, studies really are changing in flight, if you will. Something that almost always happens. It really should be expected. Mid-study changes are super common. If you make changes to paper CRFs, are there still old CRFs floating around at the sites? Are they still pulling up old attachments from old emails? So how do you ensure that they're not sending in data on obsolete case report forms, for instance? And even more serious, more grave potentially, is using an obsolete informed consent. Are sites consenting on an old consent and then proceeding with data collection that could potentially be a protocol deviation? And then also, as you prepare for studies, considering more manual tools, another consideration to take into account is the data readiness for real-time status reporting. Many aspects within there, safety reporting being an important one. Those are time-sensitive reporting safety. So if you are collecting safety reporting on paper, for instance, it makes the timeliness of that reporting up to FDA, to IRBs, much more challenging, but also in a very practical way. Executive leadership within sponsor teams often want status updates on a monthly, quarterly basis, and typically when they ask for it, they want it pretty quickly. And those executives are typically looking for something that's simple but accurate. And oftentimes the raw data that the clinical team is working with is very complex. There's a lot there. It's not simple. It's probably accurate. So compiling that information down into a form that executive teams want to see can be timely. It can take a lot of time, rather. So just considering how much time will you anticipate spending on compiling information for status reporting internally, even, it can be very important to consider as you're preparing for a study. In terms of some of the solutions to these challenges, these pitfalls, so I alluded to this before. If you are still sending materials out in binders or even electronically, best practice is really to get off of paper, eliminate paper from your life as much as possible. There are modern clinical software tools like electronic trial master files or ETMFs, managing all of the study-related documents, versions, et cetera, protocols, IRB approvals. Those are all in the ETMF. And there are software tools to capture that electronically. Clinical trial management systems, CTMS, as well as what we do here at Greenlight Guru, electronic data capture systems. They can really help you to make the management of all of that paper, if you will, much more efficient. For example, the EDC that we provide here at Greenlight Guru, and you should consider this for any EDC that you would use for a study. These types of software tools ensure that sites always are accessing the current versions of ECRFs and only the current versions of ECRF. So it's not even possible for them to access outdated versions. Also, importantly, ensuring current versions of consents are available to sites. And these software tools can automate the administrative tracking of what changes were made and when within the study. So that audit log within these software tools can help provide audit support, laying out the timeline and defending decisions that were made and when, and showing those guardrails were in place to ensure proper versions were utilized and so forth. Rasmus, I'm going to pass it back to you for the next one here.
Yes, and being in 2025 and going forward, we're just seeing much more data being collected, much more specialized systems being used. It's not unusual for larger companies to go into a clinical trial with upwards of 10 different systems that they'll have to bring to the hospital. Having a large system landscape means that using closed systems is quite the pitfall. A closed system is one where it's difficult to get data out and it's difficult to connect it to other systems. It is also referred to as silos. It's a monolith that stands there being difficult to interact with. The more systems you have, the more of an advantage it is that you can connect them. Imagine that you are on a weekly or monthly basis creating a report where you need to get data from 2 different systems. If you constantly manually have to go in and export the data and combine it, it's just a lot of man hours that could be used on other things. And it's not like when you're running clinical trials that time is a luxury. You're all very busy in that aspect. So the solution here is to find systems that utilize APIs. Without going too deep technically in it, an API is essentially a way for different systems to interact with each other. It ensures that there is a way to interact with the system without someone having to go in manually and click around using a computer interface. That enables you to automate things. And given that we have more and more data and more things you want to get done, automation is basically the key. That's more or less also what all the hype about AI is about. You can automate things that would otherwise take a lot of time for humans to do. If your systems are using APIs, there's an option to have a CGMS that you like, an EDC that you like, and maybe even finding a core lab that you like working with, and then having it all play together. It can remove manual need for transcribing from the core lab. Why not just have the systems pull data out from the core lab and insert it directly into the EDC without having a human entering the data? We all know how error-prone manual entries are. One thing to note here is that even though a system or a little script would be performing this data transfer, this itself has to be validated. And with that, I can also touch on the question asked in the chat. What does it mean to be validated? If something is validated, it means that some requirements have been set up for how it should work and perform, and then you test the system according to these requirements. So you ensure that it fulfills the requirements that you have defined. And then you essentially have documentation that the system does indeed perform as it should. And then it's in a validated state. So that's important. You must also validate this sort of stuff. Going to the next pitfall. That is thinking in a single way about consent. Consent is a funny thing these days. Depending on the data collection activity, you should consider, can I remove my paper-based consent? And what sort of consent is actually needed for this data collection activity? This will, of course, vary a lot depending on the country you're conducting the study and the risk of your device, along with the type of investigation you're doing. But to Chris's point, the more we can remove paper, the easier we can make it for clinicians in the hospital and, for instance, for our monitors. So here, if you're doing a non-interventional study with low risk, consider if you can even do away with having the patients or participants as they would be signing a consent document. Perhaps it's enough that they just tick a checkbox, similar to if they were to download an app from the App Store and that way provide the information. Because make no mistake, the amount of information people willingly give to some apps is more than what they need to provide, also of the sensitive kind, than in some clinical trials or even some investigations. Now, when it says e-consent here, that is quite a loaded word where, depending on who you ask, they'll have different ideas about what it is. In this particular scenario, I'm just focusing on removing the paper, i.e. the consent document, and digitizing it, allowing participants to sign it digitally. The advantage of signing consent documents digitally is that it will be instantly available upon signing to the other participants, well, not participants, but the other actors in this study. Your monitors will be able to see it, the investigator will be able to see it immediately, and if needed, they can countersign. It's also a way to put the patient at the center of the study. The few trials that I have participated in, I've come into the clinic, sat down with the doctor, and they have passed me the paper. In one instance, I had to take the paper that I was to sign home and think about it for 24 hours to then return to the site, to then have the two signatures placed on the document. If we can digitize it, it's also possible to remove the need for bringing the paper back. The paper will just, paper, quote unquote, will be instantly shipped to the investigator upon final signature. With consent, it's important to emphasize that signing something digitally is not an informed consent process. Informed consent is indeed a process where a lot of things have to be in place. Signing something digitally can be part of the informed consent process. So we're just removing the paper, but the rest of the process still stands with the participant being allowed to ask questions to a doctor, etc. Here it's important to say the consent required for your data collection activity will vary depending on the country you're in, how much is allowed to be digitized, along with the risk of the study. So always check with your IRB. They are ultimately the ones who will be approving it. And then we have another evergreen. So this is 4.5. It's let's call it a little surprise. As studies become more complex with more data collected, one of the pitfalls that we continue to see is that people are forgetting the clinical workflow when they are designing the study. So the protocol is created usually sitting in a nicely ventilated office in relatively calm environment where you can really let the creative juices flow and design the perfect study for your device. You're collecting all the data you would ever need via all the different methods that you might want. But once that study meets the real world, that's where friction and problems occur. Similarly, you'll see that different sites will have different ways of working. So how do we accommodate that? And the more difficult it is for the clinicians to fit the study into their general clinical workflow, the more friction occurs, and we'll see erroneous data and frustration among the clinicians. Here, the absolute top tip we have is test. Test your setup and ideally involve the clinicians that will be conducting your study. Naturally, it's going to be more difficult if you have a multi-center study with many clinicians and workflow. But here we're still looking to get some sort of testing done with clinicians as close to the situation where the data collection will happen. So if it's happening in an operating theater, check with the sites. Are all sites allowed to bring, for instance, a tablet into the operating theater? Or will some places have data collection happen outside the operating theater? And by testing and involving clinicians that will be conducting the study, we can tailor the data collection activities to fit their workflow much better. We eliminate guessing and we can take concrete actions. And ideally, you also have them run through a fake patient while they are in the situation where they'll be doing the real data collection. Because that's the only way they are gonna figure out, for instance, are the CRFs in the right order? Does it make sense to have these questions combined on the same page? Or should they actually be split out because they are filled in at different times, despite making sense thematically to be together? Then I'll toss it back to you, Chris.
Yeah, and I'll also mention a little bit of the validation piece in the context of data access. One of the pitfalls related to data access is what I'll refer to as data access sloppiness. Software tools are very good at controlling who has access to the system and what they may do within the system, but it's still possible to be sloppy in terms of personnel, participants, collaborators in the study that have access. So let me elaborate a little bit more. Some common pitfalls, you'll see there's lots of different systems involved with studies, and you probably are going to be using multiple different software tools. Ultimately, the access to and the permissions within any software tool are pretty much always going to be checked by regulatory agencies during an audit. And the reality is during study conduct, management of permissions can become quite fluid, for better or for worse, especially if the roles and the permissions of all the collaborators working on the study are not planned thoroughly in advance of the study actually starting. So for example, imagine you have a study underway and we just discovered, or we were just made aware that a particular participant, a study nurse at a particular site, perhaps they're a nurse practitioner, really needs to be able to sign off as an investigator at a site, and for whatever reason that may be permissible. and the sponsor would like to do so and may do so, but this really should be defined during study planning to anticipate these types of hybrid roles, if you will. And there really should be roles in the system that reflect those planned roles, those anticipated roles. Now, you can't anticipate everything, of course. So any changes to roles, permissions mid-study should be documented in the trial master file, the ETMF, and the roles in the EDC should reflect those changes in real time. Now, we will see sometimes in practice, kind of in the heat of battle, if you will, teams will tend to grant permissions to those that need them as a function of urgency rather than as a function of process, if you will. And the feedback that teams share with us and we recommend is really not rushing it in the face of urgency. Always revert back to process, slow down, make sure there's process being followed. The FDA will look at this, regulatory bodies will look at that and potentially slap your wrist for any missteps. Back to the validation piece, I also want to mention the functionality of the software systems that you may be using in your studies. The functionality of those tools to actually control access. Also functionality ensuring attributability or the audit log functionality within software tools, as well as the accuracy of the data that's being collected. And that's both data entry accuracy and data review functionalities. All of those functionalities must be validated, and for many different studies, those are required table stakes for data management. And some general purpose tools simply don't have some of those functionalities, data review, et cetera. And again, those functionalities have to be validated to facilitate compliance with regulations. Another aspect that has to be validated and is often very important within a study is the functionality of blinding identifiable PHI from certain participants in your study. So oftentimes we will see clinical sites. They need to be able to see patient name, identifiable information about the subject. Sponsors, alternatively, sometimes do not need that, and they simply need to blind themselves to those identifiable pieces of information. Software tools like EDC software has functionality that can do so, but again, that functionality has to have been tested and validated to perform those types of blinding, specifically for clinical studies that are, again, kind of table stakes for a lot of study designs. Another pitfall that we see is folks being added to a study and then ultimately never removed from the study access to the software. For example, if somebody, sponsor team or research coordinator at a site has left, they've gone on to a different company or to a different clinic, 6 months have gone by, that person still has access to the EDC system. Even if they're not actively in there doing anything, maliciously or otherwise, even if they just have access, that still is an issue. And for that reason, there should be documented processes, SOPs from the sponsor for discontinuation of system access for anyone that leaves a site or leaves sponsor. When someone leaves a sponsor, you're always going to take their badge, you're always going to take the computer back, but you also need to have a process in place to revoke any of their software permissions related to the study that they were working on. And again, that's just getting back to being a little bit sloppy. It's easy to overlook some of those things, but again, having processes in place. Solutions for these pitfalls really revert back or call back to the data management plan. Ultimately, the data management plan is the cornerstone around which any software procurement selection will revolve. Determining if a software tool fits into the data management plan requirements is paramount, and then subsequent usage of the software tools, again, is going to be defined by the data management plan. And again, modern tools should meet the requirements of data management plans with respect to accessing the data and limiting access therein, as well as controlling review of the data, who can view identifiable pieces of information again, and also how the data is output, the format that it's being output needs to align with the requirements of the statistical analysis plan. Tools like GreenLight Guru Clinical, EDC software tools that are out there will greatly be able to simplify the management of many different participants working within your data set while limiting what each participant can do with the data. So who is responsible for data entry, data review, locking, signing off on data, query resolution, etc. Those can all be easily controlled by software tools that have built-in guardrails to keep everyone acting in their assigned roles. And any changes to participant roles should be documented, but also within the system, their permissions need to be aligned with what they should be able to do within that software tool according to that documentation and the data management plan. Whatever EDC system is chosen, whatever software tool is chosen, really must align and allow for simple, keyword being there, simple execution, also of the preferred data review, whether that's SDV or targeted SDV. Tools, that software-based tools typically will have built-in data verification with reporting workspaces where you can review data review progress and can really ease the burden of performing risk-based data monitoring like targeted source data verification, where you might only be reviewing 80% of certain subsets of the data, whereas other subsets need to be 100% verified. So software tools can really ease the burden of those types of monitoring schemas. And from an audit perspective, looking at SOPs, having SOPs that define system access, removal of access, should neatly define how people are added as well as removed. And it's easy to follow these procedures, but it's also easy to get sloppy with it when the daily urgency that you encounter running a clinical study can get the better of us. So it's, again, always expedient to take a step back, take a deep breath, and really make sure that process comes first, even in the face of urgency. So we've talked through a number of these pitfalls, a number of these challenges here. This actually brings us to the end here, and we'll jump into the Q&A. We've got a couple questions. As we get into the Q&A, if you have additional questions, please do drop them in the chat area there and upvote those for questions that you'd like us to prioritize. So let's jump right in. We're at the 37-minute mark, so we've got plenty of time here. And let me pull up the questions here. And I'm going to share we talked about validation. Zach, your question. Any further clarification, please do drop it in the Q&A there. But let's share this question from Vishnu. Does API-based access is similar to the ones as OneDrive or Google Drive? And Rasmus, I'll probably pass this API-related question to you, if that's okay.
Mm-hmm. So that will entirely depend on the system. The system basically determines how you access the API. Some will, like Google Drive, use OAuth. Other will have dedicated API keys, so essentially bearer tokens, meaning that so long as you have the API key and the right IDs, then you will be able to communicate. That depends entirely on the system.
And Rasmus, are there any common API use cases that you see pretty typically for a system like an EDC? I've got some in mind, but I figure I get your insight there as well.
Very often, what we do a lot is integrations with CTMS systems. So clients will have found a CTMS system they like working with, and then we help them integrate GreenLight Guru Clinical with the CTMS, so it gets updates whenever new patients are included or statuses are updated. We also have a lot of cases where very custom reporting is needed, where again, the API is beneficial as you can automate pulling out data and then from there you can format it and insert it anywhere. So for very custom reporting, it's also a brilliant addition to have. And that's of course not to say that just because there is an API, everything just happens magically. It does require work to use it and get functionality set up to use it. But that's where investing the time upfront can then save time later on as you automate more or less mundane tasks, such as report generation.
We've got another question from Ella here, and I'll share this. I'll start this with my insight here from Ella to answer your question. What do auditors most often ask or look at when reviewing results of clinical studies? Consents, almost always they're gonna interrogate consents, look at consent process, data management plan they'll look at, and then review monitoring reports to ensure that monitoring was done at the effective frequency and that procedures were followed within there. And then looking at the data itself, looking at the audit log. So if you've ever worked on a paper-based study, data is often, over time, there's edits made for any number of reasons. There was an error in entry, that sort of thing. Auditors will ensure that any data changes are well documented with justifications for change. And those types of, the audit log within a software tool is essentially an automated software-driven functionality that's automatically capturing those that audit trail of any data edits over time, so that eases the burden quite a bit. On paper, typically if an answer is edited, there's a single strike through with initial and dating, and it must be legible. Nothing can be removed, blacked out, that sort of thing. So those are pretty common ones. Rasmus, anything else that's coming to mind for you? And I might have an additional thought.
Yeah, they will always check the access. They will always check that you have had control over who have had access and what level of access have they had. So they only have access for the exact period of time they need. If you're using blinding, they will always check, have blinding been maintained, both for blinding as to personal information, name, phone numbers, emails, have that been securely blinded throughout the study for the relevant people, but also randomization. Have the groups been properly blinded throughout the study? A common area that we'll also check is the documentation regarding the system. So essentially, do you have the proper documentation in place as detailed in ISO 14155 2020, specifically in 7.8.3? There you'll see a whole list of documentation that is required to be in place about the systems that you're using. So they want to see that it's documented how the backup procedure and disaster recovery is working. And they especially want to see that you have ensured the system is indeed validated as to critical actions. If you use a randomization, then that would be a case. For instance, that the emergency unblinding, that works. They also want to see documentation for that.
Another question here. This one's coming in from Carolina. What would you recommend to focus on when choosing an ECRF system? What would be best for clinical sites to make it most convenient for them? Great question. I'm assuming most everyone here is probably on the sponsor side, but any sponsors that are new to studies, this is a huge question. Will the sites uptake whatever software we choose, and what's driving their decision making? I think from my perspective, oftentimes less related to the ECRF system itself, but ultimately the design of case report forms, the volume of data that's being requested by the sponsor is one of the biggest elements as to will sites participate in the study and enter data into the system. Is the amount of data being requested? Is the data form logical? Does it flow well? Is it easy to enter data into the case report form? So a lot of it comes down to ECRF design. That's less related to the ECRF system, the software tool itself. But specifically from the software tool, from the site perspective, how easy is training on that system? Physicians, research coordinators, they probably have used a number of different softwares over time. The older systems were a little bit more clunky. Systems that potentially are net new at a site should be very easy to use. Logging in, accessing the system, is it web-based? How easy is it to navigate? How user-friendly is it? Those are big ones. Can data be saved and re-entered, completed later? Those sorts of things. Rasmus, any additional thoughts on what sites are looking for?
Sites are looking for ease of use. If it's a site that is running a lot of trials, you won't be coming with the only system they're using. They'll be routinely logging into 3, 4, 5, 6, 10 different systems every single day. So the more easy it is for them to pick up and get their jobs done, the better. Really think in terms of the jobs to be done when you're considering something for the site. So they want to be able to enter data easy, they want to be able to log in easy, they want to be able to find their patients easily, and they want to fill out data without too much hassle.
Yeah, and site training should be quick. If an EDC system requires hours of training, it's probably a little challenging to use. Typically, for Greenlight's clinical solution, it's usually 20 to 30 minutes for site training, typically. June Chalmers is asking, does Greenlight Guru have experience in using their EDC in India? Rasmus, you've been here 9 years. I'm going to pass that to you.
Fairly certain we have had studies running in India. Yeah. In general, we have had studies running in much of the world. It is web-based, so it's all about access to the internet. I'm not too familiar with India in that aspect. I know that there are a lot of people already on the internet, but yeah, the better the connection, the easier it's going to be. The only area where we have seen quite decent trouble have been China, due to the Chinese firewall that pulls websites apart when they're coming from outside of the firewall.
I'm going to jump real quickly back to Carolina's question. I just had an additional thought. For choosing ECRF systems, also the manner in which the system's accessed can be important to touch on. So some applications historically are desktop based. In the modern era, many sites have tablets dedicated to research coordinators to use for clinical research. Everyone has a smartphone, so accessibility is another big one. Many of these web-based systems like Greenlight Guru Clinical are accessible from any type of device, so that would be another focus point. Ease of use, but also ease of access using a device that's on hand already. I'm going to take one last look in the chat, or in the chat tab here. It looks like we've gotten through most of the questions here, and we're getting close to time here. So unless I see another question pop up here in the next couple seconds, we'll start to wrap. Before we do leave here, I would like to open up a quick survey. asking for your thoughts on today's session, also asking what topics you'd like to see in future sessions. So let me go ahead and launch that survey now. It's telling me that was successful. So I will leave that open. And as we wrap here, just want to say thank you to everyone who's called in from all over the world today. Rasmus, thank you for your insights during the presentation itself. And just as a quick reminder, we will be sending today's recording as well as the presentation slides. So keep an eye out for that in your email. And on behalf of Greenlight Guru, I want to thank you all for attending today's webinar. And I wish everyone a great rest of your day and a great rest of your week. We'll see you soon. See you, Rasmus.
Thank you all. Bye.